All right. Well, good Wednesday afternoon to you all. Very excited to see you back here again. And for those joining us online or who are joining us through the recording, very good to have you with us as well. I've been getting notes from different people that they're watching the recording or, they're watching it a little bit later and stuff. So it's encouraging. It's really exciting to see that this is happening. And I'm glad people are taking an interest in it. Because as I explained the very first week, I think that this is a hugely important subject in the church that has unfortunately kind of been swept under the rug just a little bit. It's not like been, abused or anything, but people are like, yeah, we just kind of don't want to deal with that right now and sweep it away. So I'm encouraged. I'm very encouraged and very excited. This week is going to be a fun week. We're going to talk about mind and body. We're going to really center our discussion around the question, do we have a soul? What does it mean to have a soul? We're gonna look at these, and there's two big areas that we're gonna cover that you can kind of see on the board there. So we'll take a look at those. We'll take a look at all of those things, and it'll be a fun week. I would like to start us off with a short word of prayer, and then we will dive in. Lord Jesus, we give you this time this evening. I'm grateful for the opportunity we have to be here, for the chance we have to think through these deeper questions that help us form a bigger and more complete worldview. And God, I give you praise and glory as the creator of both things material and, as we're going to talk about tonight, the immaterial as well. We give you praise and honor and glory for that. And I pray that this might become another anchor and another key point in our thinking that we can hang on to as we journey down this path of philosophy. Lord, we give you tonight. Teach us and instruct us, we pray. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so one quick intro note before we get into this. From a teaching perspective, this is going to be a little bit different of a night. And from you guys that are sitting there and that are watching this, you're like, that didn't feel any different to me. I wanted to give this little intro note just in case somebody goes back to watch this, or like after you guys have done a bunch more philosophy work over the next 5-10 years and you want to come back and watch this. If you don't do that, it's totally okay. But just a little bit of an intro note. This week is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be making a lot of positive arguments. I'm going to look specifically at like one or two pieces of this area of study. But I'm not really going to dive into the counterpoints too much as I've done in weeks previous. And I know I haven't done that a ton in weeks previous. I will mention a lot of counterpoints, but there's so much material packed into this specific chunk of what we're looking at. In our textbook, it's just over 100 pages worth of stuff. For reference, our normal weekly discussion is one chapter, which is about 15 to 20 pages. Yeah. So if that tells you anything, there was a ton of material this week, and I'm like, there's no possible way we're going to be able to cover all of these counterpoints and all of these different things that they talk about. So I'm going to make arguments. I'm going to say this is the way that I think that we should think about things. Again, I'm going to very briefly mention here's some other ways to think about it, just in case you're talking with somebody or you read something or you hear something and you're like, oh, I remember, a very vague note about that in this philosophy thing. And so it'll give you kind of a touch point to go off of. But just know that we're not going to dive super deep into discussion about those things. There's too much stuff. And one other little fun note, I thought about this earlier today. If somebody asks you what you did this evening, you can say, oh, I just had a class on identity metaphysics. No big deal.
A class on what?
A class on identity metaphysics. That's the official term for what we're doing today. So if you want to sound super smart, and, just show off to everybody, be like, yeah, I did a class on identity metaphysics, no big deal. So let's start off this evening with an intro question. What is it that makes you, you? Very specifically, is there something deeper than just your experiences? Is there something that accounts for you having a first-person perspective, or that accounts for you having a consciousness? Maybe a better way to sort of rephrase this question is if our bodies completely change every 7 years or so. I don't know if you know this, it's a biological fact that people have found out, but your body transitions, it regrows all of its cells about every 7 years. So if our bodies change every 7 years, are we the same person now that we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Can we still identify as that same person? And if so, how? So those are some questions to get your mind rolling. I did want to read one other quote that I think helps sort of capture what we're diving into today. This is from Colin McGinn in his work, The Mysterious Flame. He said, "How can mere matter originate consciousness? How did evolution convert the water of biological tissue into the wine of consciousness? Consciousness seems like a radical novelty in the universe, not prefigured by the after effects of the Big Bang. So how did it contrive to spring into being from what preceded it?" So he's asking this question: is it possible that consciousness just comes out of matter, or is it something else entirely? And so this is what we're going to look at today. And to kind of help ease us in a little bit, I wanted to talk just very briefly about the traditional Christian view and what traditional Christian thinkers have understood the scriptures to teach us about this, because we're going to kind of get into the weeds. We usually get into the weeds. But there's two basic things that the scriptures have taught us when it comes to thinking about the soul. Is first off that human beings exhibit a holistic functional unity. So even if there is some kind of thing that we call a soul, we still function as both matter and not. Like there's a whole functioning into being human. Like it's a single entity. It's not somehow a separated thing. And the second thing is, while a functional unity, we believe the scripture teaches, humans are nevertheless a duality of immaterial soul and a material body, both of which are intrinsically good. So both the immaterial soul and the material body being created at the very beginning, both things are intrinsically good. They were both created as good. Because I'm a Greek and Hebrew nerd, I went ahead and put up here on the board the different words that are used for the word soul and spirit. So the word for soul in Hebrew is the word nephesh, and the word for soul in Greek is the word psyche. The word for spirit in Hebrew is ruach, and the word for spirit in Greek is pneuma. You might have heard those words before. And this is actually an area that we're not really going to get into, but the scriptures seem to make some kind of distinction between these two things specifically. So for example, the nephesh is normally translated as like entire being or whole self. It also is a word that is used for the throat, because the throat, the Hebrews believed, was the source of life. Without a throat, you can't have access to food, water, or breath, all of which are necessary for life. And so your nephesh is like, it's meant to be your whole being. It's what constitutes life. The ruach, on the other hand, it's the word that's used for spirit. It's also a word that's used for like breath or wind. And so there's definitely a distinction between these two, but the distinction between these two is not important for us this week. That's a further and deeper area of study that we are not going to get into. The same thing is true of the Greek as well. Psyche literally is the word that's used for soul, and the Greeks had a concept of an immortal soul, and pneuma is the word for spirit. It's also the word for wind as well. So just know that those are present, but they're different. But for our purposes tonight, if I use them interchangeably, just know I'm meaning them in the exact same way. It's basically that scripture teaches that there is some kind of soul/spirit. It's some kind of immaterial component that is outside of the body. We also believe that the scripture teaches that after death, that the soul continues to exist in some kind of disembodied state while awaiting the resurrection of the body. We're going to get into that a little bit towards the end. Hopefully we'll have time to get into that. But I want to just give you that as a grounding. Like, this is something that is very scripturally taught. And as I was briefly mentioning before we started class, the whole concept and idea of a soul is actually a really popular idea with people. This is a little bit different from a lot of the things that we've talked about in this class before, but generally, if you're just having a conversation with somebody, you can ask them, do we have a soul? And the most common answer that people will give is, yeah, we probably have a soul. even if they're not specifically Christian or even if they're not specifically religious, a lot of people will say like, yeah, we probably have a soul. And it's one of those areas that I believe people have not integrated very well into their own worldview, because the question is, if we have a soul, but you don't believe in God or in heaven or in hell or in any kind of spiritual world, then, right, well then what is the soul? And do you believe that the soul's immortal? And do you believe that it's eternal? And if, you believe that the soul persists after death, then what do we do with that? Or the question that we were talking about before this, do animals have souls, right? Do you believe that your cat and your dog are going to be in heaven? Or do you believe that cats and dogs just simply stop existing at death? And so it's a really popular question. I think it's really important for us to grasp onto this and for us to understand this really well, because this is one of those areas that, again, it seems like it's an inherently religious area until you start getting into the meat of it and you're like, oh, this is big and vast. And the thought that I had while I was reading through some of this material was like, if the study of God is theology, then it makes sense that the study of humans, anthropology, would be not quite as complicated, but pretty darn close, because we're made in God's image. And so it's very complex, it's very big, but it's very important. So there's some issues that we're going to consider, things to think about as we're thinking about the mind and the body. The first question that we're really going to ask ourselves is consciousness, so our mental perspectives or our mental properties, are they physical, or are they what philosophers call irreducibly material, or mental, not material? Are they irreducibly mental? So basically, is our consciousness, or is our mental states, like, our thinking or our feeling about things or our being aware of things, is that something that comes from a physical process, or is it something that has to come from what we call the mental realm? Is it something other than what's in the physical realm? Because if it's something other than what's in the physical realm, then we have to be willing to say that there's some immaterial thing that makes up our mind. The second question that we're probably going to look at a little bit is the human self, when I say I, is that self physical or is that self immaterial? How do I identify as I, and what do I mean when I say I? And then the third question is, if consciousness and the human self are immaterial, then how do mind and matter, or how do soul and body interact? Or do they interact at all? And so those are the big questions that we're going to ask. And again, I mean, it's just very simple stuff that we're looking at this week, no big deal. So we have a couple of charts that I want us to look at, and I did my best to draw these charts, and I apologize if they're a little wonky. I drew them with one marker, and the marker wasn't dark enough, so I redrew them with another marker, because that's just what I do. So we're basically going to look at two areas of study tonight. We're going to ask ourselves, what view of consciousness are we going to take? Or basically, is there a place where we can say consciousness is most likely grounded in this specific spot here? Now, as you can see by this beautiful little bubble chart, there are a lot of different ways to understand where we ground consciousness. There are two main specific camps. There's the physicalism camp, which, as you might be able to guess by the name, is a camp of thought or school of thought that says we can ground consciousness in primarily physical stuff. We can say that consciousness comes out of mainly something physical, or there's some kind of physical something that accounts for consciousness. A dualism, or a dualistic thought, says that there's actually some other thing apart from the physical realm that we hold to. And so there's two different kinds of dualists. There are emergentists, and we'll get into this very, very briefly, but basically an emergentist says that our brains, or any system, really has become so complex that it has given rise to another substance that they call the soul. And then there are property dualists that says that there are two actual things that exist separately from each other, but that somehow interact with each other, is a property dualist. And so those are the two states of consciousness. We're going to look primarily at property dualism, because that's, I believe that's not only the most scriptural, but to me that seems the most logical option. On the physicalist side, and again, I want to just briefly mention these so you have a little touch point if you hear these at all. You have behaviorism. And behaviorism basically says that consciousness equals behaviors. And so when you perform a certain behavior or when you perform a certain action, habitual action or whatever it is, that behavior itself is the consciousness that is happening. And again, it gets way deeper than that. And if some of these don't make sense, it's because I very oversimplified them. But just know that behaviorism more or less says that consciousness is equal to behaviors. You have type identity. And again, this one gets really deep, but basically says that consciousness is a type or a state of the brain. And so it's when a brain is in this specific state, then you have consciousness. And when the brain is not in that specific state, you don't have consciousness. Functionalism says that consciousness is equal to a function of input and output. And so if you were to put in one input, you will get something out as a different output. And then materialism, this is extremely strict materialism, but materialists say that consciousness is non-existent, doesn't exist. We're all just matter and stuff bumping into each other, and there is no such thing as consciousness. It's all illusion. So those are views of consciousness. And again, we're going to look specifically at property dualism, and we're going to make some arguments for that. But then our second area of study, after we get a view of, where do we ground consciousness? Where do we say, like, I am a conscious being. I understand that I have this in my brain. How do we identify ourselves? Or can we say that humans are more or less equal to this? And so again, when I say I, what do I mean when I say I? Is there something that I can equate with me specifically? And so again, views of identity tend to break as views of consciousness do because the two are intrinsically linked into physicalism and dualism. So on the physicalist side, you have identity. Animalism or animalists believe that humans are basically animals, which again makes sense by the name, but that humans retain their identity by being a self-organizing event. Basically, it's matter that has managed to organize itself into one coherent thing for a long enough period of time where it retains some kind of identity. The second view of identity on physicalism is the brain, which basically says that you are your brain. 100% you are your brain. It's like if your brain were taken out and moved somewhere else, you would go somewhere else. Pretty simple, thankfully. The third one, it's really called what's it called? It's some kind of thing that's bigger. Yeah, material constitution. That's it. Big word you don't need to know, but just know that like the material stuff that people are made up of says that humans are basically equal to anything that has a potential for a first-person awareness or first-person consciousness. It's grounded in the causal powers of the brain, and so these two are very closely linked, but they're distinguished by if you can have first-person consciousness or not. And then the fourth one, this is kind of a fun one, is called four-dimensionalism. And this basically says that humans are four-dimensional creatures that are stretched across a period of time, and that you are equal to your history, and you are composed of temporal parts. And so there's only a small piece of you that actually exists over the entire period of time, and your consciousness is basically you just experiencing those events over time. And so we don't exist as three-dimensional beings, we actually exist as four on this view. On the flip side, you have dualism. And again, I know this is long and boring and tedious. I'm just saying all these for reference. But on the dualism side, you have three main views that you look at. You have Cartesian dualism, which comes from Descartes. And this is your standard. You have a body and you have a soul, and your body and your soul interact with each other. Your mind is immaterial, and your mind is what contains your consciousness. So this is what a lot of people think of when you think soul, or like the Pixar movie Soul, very, very Cartesian, because Joe's soul is able to be completely separate from his body and still has consciousness and still has the ability to think. And so his consciousness is something separate from his brain. So that's a good way to remember Cartesianism. The second type, and I actually fall into this camp of human identity, of Aristotelian/Thomistic dualism. And very, very briefly to sum up this, it says that souls are what Aristotle called forms, and these forms give shape to matter. And so when a form and matter interact with each other, the form gives matter shape and gives it function and lets it do what it does. And as the matter interacts with the other matter around it, it makes impressions on the soul. And so, again, on this view, humans are form, but they are also matter. Beings of pure form exist. They're called angels. And so you can think of it sort of as like the form is a blueprint that the matter then meets up with and they create the thing. And then you have Haskarian dualism. And this is our last big word for the day, but Haskarians are emergentists. They're the ones who believe that the soul is something that has emerged out of our brain. And so it's something that is intrinsically tied to and something that is caused by our brain states. All right. So now that we have said a lot of really big words, we've talked ourselves around in circles for a little bit, let's ask a simple question. Why should we think that consciousness is immaterial? Why should I be a property dualist, or why should I think that there's any such thing as a soul when there's so many other options that I can believe? Why think that this one specific view seems to be the right one? Why think that they're mental instead of physical? So let's take a look at some of these. Now, there's a really important phrase, and it seems like a math equation when you look at it, but it's more of a logic equation after you've looked at it for a little bit. And this is going to be very key for us in understanding why it's important for us to think that we have a soul. And so the equation, or the rule of thought, simply says this. It says, if x equals y, if one thing is equal to another thing, then whatever is true of x must also be true of y, necessarily in logic. So this is to say that if x is something, let's say if x is an apple and y is red, then whatever is true of an apple must be true of red, the color. And so we would say, okay, if you put it in that way, like, yeah, I'm able to say that, that doesn't make a ton of sense, right? There are things that are true of an apple that are not true of the color red, right? Like an apple is sweet. An apple is a three-dimensional object. I can throw an apple, but I can't throw red. Red is not inherently sweet, right? Red is not a three-dimensional object. And so on this, we would say that, okay, we can probably say that X being apple and Y being red, those two things just don't match up with each other because there's too much differences that can't possibly be equated with each other. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to look at placing inside of this statement, excuse me, I'm stuttering today. We're going to place inside of this statement on X, we're going to say X is mental states and Y is physical, the physical realm, right? So, for example, if somebody wanted to be a physicalist, or if somebody wanted to hold to physicalism and say you are nothing but your brain, then what they're saying is that everything that is true about your brain is also true about your mental states, or all of your mental states can be pointed at some specific part of your brain that is just functioning. And so we can equate these two things that says if our mental states are only equal to something that is physical, then whatever is true of our mental states must also be true of the physical reality that they're matched to. Does that make sense? It's an equality thing. So we say if it's true of this, then it must also be true of this. So let's ask ourselves, is there a difference between mental consciousness and between physical states? Can we possibly come up with any kind of differences that are between those? Well, I think that the first argument for being some kind of dualist, holding that we have some kind of soul, is that there seems to be very clear differences between our mental conscious states and between physical states. So think about it in this way. There seems to be some kind of raw difference, or there seems to be some kind of raw feel of what it's like to having a mental state. So for example, you know what it's like to feel pain. You know what that feels like specifically, and there's some kind of raw qualitative feel to that. But that doesn't seem to happen inside of a physical state, right? The fact of a rock, or that a rock is physical, there's nothing about a rock that would say that, yeah, there's a kind of raw qualitative feel or a what's it like to describing a rock that also is able to translate to the same sense of like being in pain or having a sense of pain. I know that doesn't make a ton of sense as we explained it to start, but it's this idea of there's a sense or a feeling of what it is like to be something. And so we do this with our imaginations a lot, right? Like what would it be like to be a fish? Or would it be like to be a bird, right? Or what would it be like to be a cloud or a tree? And so we have those mental states, and there's sort of that raw qualitative feel where we're able to like imagine what that is like. That it can't be explained only in terms of physical states. There's nothing inherent about physical states that says this is what it is like to be something. Another, what I think clear differences between consciousness and physical states is that many mental states have intentionality. You're going to hear this word come up a lot in this, and I think we mentioned it was last week or 2 weeks ago. But thinking about intentionality, it's an ofness or it's aboutness towards something. And so your mental states are often about something else, or they're very directed toward something else. So again, you can have a thought about your summer vacation, or you can think about how hot it is outside. It is really hot outside. Or you can have a thought about the color of the chair that you're sitting in. But physical things don't seem to have an aboutness to them, right? There is nothing about, this marker has no aboutness to it. If you are thinking about the marker, your thought is intrinsically related to the marker, but the marker itself has no ofness. There's no intentionality to it being solely physical. And again, we'll look at intentionality as we talk more specifically. We'll get into it. We start talking that many mental states have an intentionality, or they're directly related to something that they don't seem there doesn't seem to be inherent inside of physical things. Mental states are often inner, private, and immediate to the subject that is having them. So for example, you can say, I am feeling confused in philosophy class. And you have that as a mental awareness, but it's impossible to take that first person experience of saying I am confused and take that language and turn it into a third person explanation where I can specifically say, oh, this person's brain is doing this, and this, and that is producing what we call confusion. There's no way to take that first person experience and translate it into completely third person language without losing some kind of really important information. So your mental states are inner and private. There's something immediate to the subject that's having them. Mental states also require a subjectiveness, namely mental states are necessarily owned by the subject who has them. So again, you are having your thoughts specifically. Again, possibly I'm confused in philosophy class, and I'm having my mental states of I hope they're not confused in philosophy class. And we're able to have these two sort of different mental states that can't seem to be described by any sort of physical property. And mental states often fail sometimes to have crucial features that characterize physical states. So for example, spatial location, right? It's really hard to say that my belief about a frog being green is to the left or to the right of my thought that Superman is a super cool superhero. It's almost impossible to say that our mental states have that kind of feature that is very characteristic of a physical state, or that it's composed of parts, like a neuron, for example. A neuron is in the brain and it's composed of parts, but our mental states, our consciousness doesn't seem to be composed of different parts. It seems to be just kind of one thing. It just is. And so there's some differences there. Again, maybe not necessarily super clear, but differences there between consciousness and physical states. We can also talk about dualism and why I think we should accept dualism in looking specifically at what we call a knowledge argument. And I think I've made this argument to you before. I'm almost positive that I had. So it's a standard thought experiment. We're going to imagine that there is a brilliant scientist. Her name is Mary. And Mary has been blind from birth. But Mary, being the brilliant scientist, she knows all the physical facts relevant to the act of seeing, right? She knows everything there is to know, but she knows like rods and cones and retinas. She knows all about colors and electron states and how an electron moving from one state to another state emits a certain wavelength of light and how your eyes are able to pick that up. She knows everything that there is to know about the act of seeing something. And then by some miracle, Mary is able to see. She suddenly gains the power of sight. And upon gaining the power of sight, the very first thing that she sees sitting in front of her is a red apple. I just love picking on red apples today. I don't know why. But the very first thing that she sees is a red apple, and immediately her brain is able to register, I know that this is an apple, and I also know that this is the color red. But the knowledge argument says that Mary learns something intrinsic. Mary learns something upon seeing the color red that she could not have known otherwise. That there's some sort of difference between the physical facts about an object and the experience or the mental state of perceiving an object. And so the knowledge argument breaks down knowledge, and we're not going to talk about knowledge because we've gone into that already, but it breaks down knowledge into these three different categories of knowledge by acquaintance, of propositional knowledge, and of know-how. And it says that Mary learned something very important and something that you can't learn otherwise by being able to see the color red and the apple itself appearing in that way. And so, so when she's sensing the apple, she's aware of it and has the experience of seeing the apple and of seeing red. So it's learning something about red upon seeing it and upon gaining that kind of knowledge. And that seems to be something that is impossible to do on a purely physicalist view. If we can learn every possible physical thing there is to know about something, but still learn something new upon coming into contact with it, upon experiencing it, then there has to be something beyond just the physical knowledge of something. And again, if there's something that is beyond physical, we can't totally describe it with physical, then something that is mental cannot be equal to something that's primarily physical. So this is where we start getting into that a little bit. The third thing, and this is that whole idea of intentionality again, but consciousness and intentionality is something that is extremely important. And so I wanted to make sure that we hit on it again, that there is no physical state, nothing physical has intentionality. And so there are at least some mental states that can't be physical. And so let's think about this for a little bit. Intentionality is something that it's completely unrestricted with regard to the kind of object it can hold. Anything, whatever, can have a mental act directed at it, right? You can think about anything in the world. You can think about thinking. That's crazy. But as you think about thinking, or as you can think about all of these different things, you are directing your mental state at it. You're making your mental state of or about something. But physical relations are, again, they're unable to do that, except for there's a very narrow range of objects that are able to attract or are able to, put out something that maybe is directed towards something else. We think of magnetic fields that attract certain things, but those magnetic fields, are not of, or they're not about the thing they're attracting. And so there seems to be a difference in that. We can also say that to grasp a mental act, one must engage in a reflexive act of self-awareness, right? So to think about your mental state, or to think about the thoughts that you're having, or again, if you're having the thought, I am confused, I don't know what's going on, you're immediately engaging in an act of self-reflection. You're saying, okay, I'm reflecting upon myself. I am, looking inward, if you will. And this act of self-awareness is saying, I am aware of myself. I am aware that this is the state that I am in. But we note that no such internal thinking is required to grasp any kind of physical relation, right? There's no kind of internal thinking that's needed to say that the cup is sitting on top of the podium. So there's nothing inherently reflexive about the physical state of an object. One last one, and then I'll give you a small example of it. For ordinary relations, or each of the things. No, we're not going to do that. I lied to you. Let's think about an example of intentionality, though, because again, I think this is so important. So this is kind of a fun thought experiment. It comes from John Searle, and he called it the Chinese room. And so here's what he said. He said, imagine that you're locked in a room, and inside of this room are several baskets full of Chinese symbols. And so you can imagine that maybe you're like me, you don't understand a word of Chinese. No idea. I have no idea what the symbols are called. None of it. I have no idea. But you're given a rule book in English for manipulating the Chinese symbols, right? So the rules specify the manipulation of the symbols purely formally and in terms of their syntax and not their semantics. So basically, it gives you the rules that says if you put this specific symbol with this specific symbol, it means, or like if somebody gives you this symbol, then you need to give back this symbol. Or like if you see this symbol, then this is the symbol that goes with it. So it's a matter of grammar. Like it shows you what symbols go together, but it doesn't tell you anything about what they mean, is the rules. And so the rules specify that as you're dealing and as you're messing with these symbols, it gives them to you in terms of grammar and not in terms of meaning. And so there's a rule that might say, take this box-shaped symbol out of basket 1 and put it next to this temple-shaped symbol from basket number 2, right? And so the rules give you the ability to manipulate the symbols in that way. So now we have our basket of Chinese symbols sitting in front of us. So now let's think that there's some other Chinese symbols that are passed into the room from the outside. And with these symbols, you're given more rules for passing back out now other Chinese symbols that go back out of the room. So they pass in more symbols. I like to think of them as little wooden blocks. They pass in more symbols with rules that says, when you get these symbols, I want you to pass back out these specific ones. And suppose that unknown to you, the symbols that are passed into the room are called questions by the people that are outside of the room. And the symbols that you pass out of the room are called answers to the questions, but you don't know this. So suppose even further that these people who are giving the rules, they're so good at giving you the rules, like they're so descriptive at it. You are just master at reading these rules and at giving them the exact symbols that they want out, that very soon your answers to these questions are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. So there you are, you're sitting locked in your room, you're moving these Chinese symbols around, you're passing these symbols out in response to these incoming Chinese symbols, right? You're able to take what they have, you're able to go through all the rules and be like, I know exactly what to give, and you spit it back out. So now here's the point of this story. The point of the story is that by virtue of just putting in some kind of formal computer program, because that's all a computer program is, right? It says, I want you to operate under these rules in this specific way. By virtue of implementing this kind of computer program, from the point of view of an outside observer, you behave exactly as if you understood Chinese, but all the same, you don't understand a lick of it. You have no idea what you're actually putting out. And so this is something that becomes really important as we think about intentionality, right? Because if our thoughts are intentional about it, if we are thinking about the Chinese characters that we're giving, then we have some kind of knowledge, probably the semantics. We probably have the meaning of the Chinese symbols, and it's not simply just a matter of being able to pass symbols back and forth with the appearance that we know Chinese, but actually there's something deeper in understanding that we actually know, that our thoughts are about the information that is being passed to us and then being passed out. Does that make sense? So there's there's this upper level up here, right, where we're able to come up with some kind of situation or scenario that says, all right, I can feasibly come up with an idea that says, if I'm able to input a certain, let's call it English even, if I'm able to input certain English characters in the right order, then I will get a certain output of English characters, right? We do this with computers all the time. Anytime you go into Google and type in Google, did the Broncos win the 1994 Super Bowl? I don't think they did. But Google will be able to, based on the rules that people have given it, Google will spit out what it knows, or what we call an answer to the question that we have given it. However, Google doesn't have this second layer. Google doesn't have an understanding. This is understand. Or aboutness. Sorry, my handwriting is really bad. Google has no understanding or aboutness as to what it's giving you. All Google has done is take the information you have given it. It has followed rules that it has been given. It has now spat out the information that the rules have dictated that it needs to give you. And so functionally, Google acts like it knows everything. Right? Google acts like a super genius that would be the best at trivia ever. But formally speaking, Google has no understanding because it is purely a physical thing. And so its physical processes, it can't be about any of that, or it has no understanding of that. So when you type into Google the word, I'm trying to think of a good word that would help. You type into it the word smelly trash, right? You type into that. Google can spit out different things to you that says, oh, well, smelly trash this, and maybe you get a news story about how there was a dump truck that spilled over on I-65, and there's all of these different things, but Google has no understanding of what smelly trash actually is. There's no aboutness to Google's thoughts. Maybe another good example is if you've ever tried to mess with Google Translate before and you've seen people put one language through and it just runs through, it runs through one language, and then when you try and put it back, it doesn't go quite exactly back the way that it's supposed to. It's because Google's been given specific rules that says, if you get this character, then put this one back, but it doesn't have that deeper meaning. It doesn't know what the words themselves are about, which is why human translators are always better than computer translators. Because human translators have an aboutness inside of them. We have our consciousness that is able to say, if I think about the word spirit, right? If I think about the word spirit, I know that inherently I'm talking about something, like non-physical, something that, might interact with the body somehow. And so I have this understanding of this aboutness about spirit. Whereas if I put spirit into Google, I'd probably get, some different ideas. I'd be able to translate it into a language. But then if I were to put, pneuma or ruach back into Google, it might spit out spirit, but it might also spit out wind. And so then we've gone from spirit now to wind. And then if I put wind into, Arabic, or put it into Chinese, it might spit something back out and it might give me breath, right? And so we've moved from the word spirit now to something completely semi-related, but really different because there's no aboutness, there's no intentionality inside of material processes. Does that help? Cool.
What were you just explaining? It helps me know what.
Yes.
What?
So this helps you know. No, this is good. This is really good. So this helps you know that there is something in the mental state, right? There is an intentionality, or there is something about the mental state that we cannot describe with purely physical processes. That no matter how hard we have tried, even no matter how hard we have looked at the brain, there's something about mental processes that we just can't seem to describe with physical states. We cannot say there's a specific physical state that matches this specific mental state. It can't be described in terms of purely physical things. Because again, physical things are not about anything.
So a robot cannot become a person like Vision.
Yeah, so this is where we start getting into some fun sci-fi territory, right? Because people have thought, well, what if we could somehow make physical, these mental capabilities? It's usually called artificial intelligence, right? What if we could describe the entire mental world? And you start getting some really fun ideas of, would robots be considered humans if we could create their consciousness, if they could be completely conscious? Would we consider robots as having a soul? Or if robots were completely conscious and, they had this kind of AI system, would we be able to enslave robots? Would they technically be human? Would they have rights? And so it's actually this really big question inside of science fiction that people are really scared about, that we're getting super close to, and we're not anywhere even close to it yet. But it's this idea of, can we possibly do it? And if we could, what would be the outcome because of it? So Vision's a really good example. Vision is something that we know, or at least we know of right now, can't possibly exist because there's no physical state that can perfectly describe some kind of mental state. And so because of this, because of all of those, again, super crazy and kind of complicated things we talked about, it seems that this idea of property dualism, or this idea that we have a soul, that there is something outside of our physical body that is able to interact with our physical body, it seems like there's something outside of it that might be able to engage in these different kind of things. If the soul or the mind has some kind of consciousness inside of it, it's immaterial, and so it's able to be about things. It's able to direct itself to things in a way that other physical things cannot. Yeah. So that's my argument or do we have a soul, around the views of consciousness? Again, I know that that felt like a lot. You might be like, that didn't prove anything to me. Yeah.
I just have a super quick question.
Yes.
You're talking about consciousness and the soul. Are you saying consciousness equals soul?
Yeah. Yeah. So right now, so I'm saying if we have, yes, that's basically what I'm saying right now. So views of consciousness is, so we know, maybe this is a better way to explain. So all humans know and generally acknowledge that we have some form of consciousness. And consciousness means that I am aware of myself. And so the question is, if we are aware of ourselves, where do we ground, like, what is the thing that brings that into being? What is the thing that brings that awareness into being?
As
Why?
Christians, we also believe that we have an awareness of another being besides ourselves.
Well, and that's actually one of the counter arguments to having a soul that we get to later down here in identity that people have offered in the medieval. No, it was later. It was David Hume. It was like 1800s. But they said that if we do have a soul, and if the soul is able to reflect on itself, how does the soul know something outside of itself? That's a bigger question. We're not gonna have time to get into that. But so since we all have this understanding of we're conscious, we can say, like, I have an understanding of I have an understanding of who I am. The question is, where does that now come from? And so because we're able to say our mental states or our conscious states, so consciousness is what I've been referring to as mental. Maybe that's better. And so our conscious states are more properly grounded, and they more properly can said to become from something immaterial, like a soul, than they can said to become, or than they can said to be from something. Because our states can have properties that physical things cannot. So if our mental states have properties that physical things cannot, then there has to be something non-physical that accounts for our mental states. And so if we are to ground our mental states in something non-physical, we have to ask, what is that thing that is non-physical that we say our mental states come from? And that's where we get soul. Did that answer the question? Help track the train of thought a little bit. I know I've been kind of jumping around a lot. That first part, I guess I didn't read it nearly as well as I thought I had. But that first part, I was like, okay, yeah, I got that, but that seems to be a little bit dry. Because again, it's like, okay, I'm kind of getting that, but why does that matter? What impact does that have on me? So if you want to look more into that, I encourage you to look more into that. But the big question that people usually like to ask is to say, okay, if it's reasonable, if it's rational for us to believe that we have a soul, let's ask the question of identity. If there is a soul, or if there's not a soul, can I possibly say that I am that thing? Can I say that I am somehow my soul, or is there something about me that is, that endures long enough that I can say, yeah, that thing is me, whatever that enduring thing is. And so let's ask the second question that might help bring this this soul idea into maybe into a realm where we can play with it a little bit more. Let's ask ourselves, why should we think that humans should be identified with a thing called a soul? And then we can go back and say, is there such a thing as a soul? But why think that humans should be identified with something as a soul? Well, it might be able to help, or it might be helpful to start with distinguishing what makes humans different from other physical artifacts. Right? Why should we distinguish humans from other physical things that exist in the world? So let's do another thought experiment. And if you've watched WandaVision, or if you've seen the Marvel Universe, you've actually heard of this thought experiment before. This thought experiment is called the Ship of Theseus. And the thought experiment about the Ship of Theseus basically says that there is a ship, it's a Greek ship that exists, where Theseus and the youth of Athens, when they were out at war and they returned, the ship had 30 oars, and it was an awesome ship that they had. And the Athenians, they took it and they preserved this ship. They preserved it all the way down to the time of Emperor Demetrius. And then during this time of the emperor, they started taking old planks away from it as these old planks decayed, and they started putting in new and stronger timber. Right, so they started taking old planks and they started replacing them so that the ship could stay a standing example for all people. And so we start asking ourselves the question of, if the ship is slowly but surely replaced, if all of the boards, if all of the internal pieces of it get slowly but surely replaced, plank by plank and nail by nail, it seems as though the ship eventually that had once sailed the seas no longer has any of its original parts. It ceases to be at some point the ship of Theseus, right? And so as you're taking these different parts away, the question that we are asking ourselves is the ship being replaced or is it being repaired? Are you, as you take away these different pieces from the ship, are you replacing them with something new, or are you simply repairing the thing that was there by itself? And so this is kind of an interesting question that we start dialoguing. Let's make the story a little bit crazier, though. So let's embellish the story. Suppose that every time an original wooden part of the ship is replaced, instead of using a piece of wood, the ancient Greeks used a plank of frozen green jello. And that wood is not used. So then let's suppose further that all of these original parts that are being now replaced with original green jello, that they're being removed, but they're being saved, they're put in a warehouse, and then years later, after all of the pieces have been replaced by green jello, so the thing that is now being hailed as the ship of Theseus is now all green jello, and the thing that is in the warehouse is reassembled back into the exact same structural construction that it was when it was the ship of Theseus. And so we have to ask ourselves, which one of these structures is the real ship of Theseus? Is it the one that was slowly and over time replaced with pieces of frozen green jello? We're not worried about how they got green jello to freeze for that long. But is it this ship that was slowly but surely replaced with all this? Or is it the ship that had the original parts that was somehow put back together in terms of its original composition? Well, there's a sort of common sense intuition that we have, and there are many philosophers who agree that the original ship is the one with the same parts and the same structure. It's not the green jello ship. Thank goodness. But so what do we learn from this thought experiment? What do we learn about this replacing of these different pieces of the ship? Well, I think there's 4 important things that we can learn. The first one is that physical artifacts, specifically physical things, they don't maintain this sort of absolute strict sense of identity as they undergo change. So an artifact can't lose old parts and gain new parts and still be the exact same ship, right? Maybe think about a kitchen table or like a patio table that you've had before. And if there's a board right down the middle of it that starts to rot out from wear and tear, when you replace that board with a brand new one, we say that, yeah, the table is generally the same, but it's not exactly the same table that it was before I replaced this plank, right? Because it's got a new, different part to it. And so as the table has undergone the sort of change, we might say, yeah, it's the same table, but it's not exactly the same table. I think the second thing that we can learn from the ship of Theseus is, if we begin to ask ourselves what it is that unites the different various stages of the ship as it goes, right? We have maybe just there's one board that has been taken out and replaced with another one, or maybe half of the ship has been taken out and replaced with another one. The only thing that really seems to unite them is their relationship to each other and their non-relationship to everything else that is not those specific things. Again, that seems a little bit high and lofty thinking, but basically it says that we call the new board part of the ship of Theseus if we've only replaced one, because it has some sort of standing relation to the rest of the boards around it. Or again, to go back to use the kitchen or patio table, we say that new board is part of the table because it stands in some kind of relation to everything else around it, but it's not really part of, or it wasn't really an original part of the table. And so these physical artifacts seem to exhibit, again, the sort of loss of some part of their identity with physical change. The third thing, and maybe you started picking up on this already, but the third is that identity for a physical object, it seems to be somewhat arbitrary and comes in degrees, right? So the question that helps us maybe best understand this is the question, if we are taking the ship of Theseus and we are replacing it with frozen jello parts, at what point does it stop becoming the ship of Theseus and it start becoming a green jello ship? A what?
A salad.
A salad, yes. At what point does it stop being the ship of Theseus and it start being a salad? The number seems to be kind of arbitrary. Like we seem to be able to just kind of pick, is it 50%? Is it when 51% of the boards have been taken out and it's now 51% green jello? It's 49% boards. Is that when it stopped being the ship of Theseus? Is it when 80%?
Or does it continue to be the ship of Theseus as long as we recognize it as being the ship of Theseus?
Well, and that's the other piece to it. Do those pieces stand in relationship somehow to people that are viewing it outside as, this is the actual ship of Theseus? And I think that's more a question of definition than it is of the identity of the ship itself. Because the ship of Theseus, if we define it strictly as it's the ship that Theseus and his crew sailed the seas on, if that ship were to be replaced by another ship, an exact model of it, and people were to look at the model and say, that's the ship of Theseus, they might not be aware that it is not the ship of Theseus, but in reality, the identity of the ship is not the ship of Theseus because it's a model. So we see this in museums a lot, right? Museums have replicas of everything because they don't want to keep the art out where people can take it and steal it. And so people who go into the museum, they look at the art and they're like, oh, this art piece is, this is the actual art piece that I'm seeing, when in reality, it's probably a replica of the art piece that you are seeing. And so we fall into a little bit of a definitional trap when we start saying, if I just believe that thing is it, then is it that thing? And as far as an identity definition, I would say, no, it's not actually, if we're looking at a Michelangelo painting, right? If I'm seeing around, seeing the Michelangelo paint, I'm just seeing a replica.
Basically, we're saying all this to say this thing doesn't have a soul.
Yes. So what I'm saying is we're looking right now at we're describing, what's the identity of a physical object.
So I have another thing for Marvel.
Okay, hang on. Because I want to bring back up the Marvel thing in relationship to the ship of Theseus when we compare a physical object with a person. Right. So if we start looking at these things called physical objects and we say, okay, physical objects, if they undergo change, then they don't maintain absolute strict identity. The thing that unites them is sort of just like relationship to the other parts of it. And that somehow the identity of the physical object is it's arbitrary when you start replacing parts. Because at some point you cross a barrier and it seems to be different for everybody. You cross a barrier where the thing no longer is what you said it was. The thing no longer is the ship of Theseus. But let's take that now and let's compare that to a view of personhood, right? Because our understanding of persons seems to be that when I have this sense of I, or when I have this sense of me as a person, I seem to not fit into that pattern because I persist over vast periods of time and over vast changes, right? When I was 5 years old, I was not 6'2" and a weight heavier than what I'm willing to tell you. But by undergoing those changes, have I ceased being Michael and have I become something different that is also called by the same name? Or am I the same person now, definitionally, not, socially and not, and action-wise, but am I the same person now that I was then? Has my identity as the thing called Michael somehow persisted for 23 years now? I forgot how old I was. So this idea of there is something called me, there is something called the being of Michael that persists. This is what's often called the absolute view of personal identity. And this case that I want to give you, and this is a case for a dualist sense of identity. But this idea of an absolute sense of identity, it basically says that humans differ from physical artifacts in that persons maintain a strict absolute sense of sameness through change. That regardless as to what change you go through, you still maintain this sense of I am still me, that I am still the being called Michael. And we see this, right, when people maybe lose an arm, or lose a leg, or a foot has to be amputated, or they lose some physical part of them, your appendix gets taken out. You don't change personal identity somehow as the ship of Theseus or as your kitchen table might change identity.
You get a heart implant.
All right, you get a heart implant. You lose the central part of your blood system. So this idea says that personal identity, it's absolute. It doesn't come in degrees. It's not somehow partial. It's not somehow relegated by, if you have this many body parts, then you are still this human. But if you lose these body parts, that you somehow become not that person, you become some different person. Personal identity it's not anything like that. It's, again, we don't say that if a person lost an arm and a leg that they would somehow become a different person, or if a person loses the bottom half of their body, if they lose ability to use their legs, or if they lose their legs, period, we don't somehow say that because this person has lost roughly 50% of their body, they're now a different thing, right? They no longer exist as the person that they once were. They now are this other person. It's this idea that personal identity it's not like that. It's an all or nothing affair. It's something that is absolute. And so this is where we get into this idea of, okay, if I am absolute, is there something about me that is not physical that allows me to persist through these changes? Another really important thing about this absolute personal identity is that it's something that's unanalyzable. It's something that's very primitive. Basically, it can't be broken down into something else that is more basic. Right? You can't take your personal identity and you can't say, oh, well, your personal identity is just, it's this physical piece. It's just carbon interacting with hydrogen. Now, again, we have to distinguish between the philosophical meaning of this and the social or personal meaning of this, because philosophically, when we say identity, we're saying like you are this one specific thing. But when we talk about it socially or personally, we're saying, people talk about, oh, I changed my identity, or I've changed as a person in the 20 years that I have been brought up, right? I've had all these different experiences that have changed who I am, and you've changed behaviorally, and maybe you've changed developmentally. Again, you've lost function of some of your body parts. I've heard that that's something that happens as you grow older. But definitionally, you are still the same person that you were however many years ago.
So how does that jive with me being a new creation?
Yeah. So we will get to that. I'm going to make time for it. Because that's the question of, if I have this view of identity, how does it persist after death? What does it mean for it to persist after death? So we're going to get there. I want to make one more point about an absolutist view. Is that the best way to So the best way to understand this absolute sense of identity, or this thing that we call I, is basically the soul, or this sort of absolute sense of understanding. It's the best way to account for the thing that we call I, or what some people in psychology have called the ego, which is I. And so most people who hold to an absolutist view say that substance dualism, basically that we have a soul, is the best way to account for understanding of what we call I. And so my goal tonight was to try and present you with this idea of not only is property dualism the most likely because it can account for things that the physical alternatives can't just seem to account for, but in addition to that, our view of identity, the thing that we call me, it has to have some sort of immaterial component. In order for me to be able to persist through all of the different changes that I make physically, there has to be something that I can identify with that is not physical, that is outside of those physical things.
Can I just say something real quick?
Yes.
As you get older, there's this shock when you look in the mirror once in a while, because in your head, you still feel like you're 20 or 30, and you walk by that mirror and go, oh, no, I'm not.
Yeah, so as you think about this idea of an absolutist view, that I have this I have this sense of identity. Absolutely. There's some arguments that you can make for this argument. One of them, I'll just mention very briefly, going back again to the WandaVision, to the MCU. You can actually make a case for absolutism by saying that there are cases that philosophers call switch cases, where, for example, if you were to take two people and you were to like somehow take the brain or the consciousness of those two people and you were to flip them, would they still retain their same consciousness or consciousnesses? I don't know what the plural of it is. But if you take them and you flip them, what happens, right? And people have done different movies and stuff about this. Or if God wanted to, God could take he could take one person, he could put them into another person's body, he could give them all the same memories and experiences as that other person. But in terms of identity and in terms of switching bodies, if you will, it still seems as though this person, even though they have all the memories and experiences of this other person, they still retain some form of their identity. So the way that this relates to Marvel is in the WandaVision episode where they talk about the ship of Theseus. The whole point is that Vision's consciousness has become its own entity, its little mind stone, that has been given form by Wanda's power, right? Her power, it inherently has Vision's consciousness inside of itself. And this Vision is facing off with, let's see if I can do this. Yeah, it's facing off with the other Vision that has all of the same materials as the old Vision, right? It is completely and totally the exact same materials as the old Vision materially, but has none of the consciousness of the old Vision. And so they're looking at each other and they're fighting in this library, and this Vision asks this one, he says, which one is the real Vision? Let's think about the ship of Theseus, right? If you start replacing parts, if one part is complete, like if the whole entire ship of Theseus is completely replaced, is it still the ship of Theseus? And so the question that we have here is the consciousness of Vision, is that the real Vision? Or is the material, the stuff that made up Vision, is that the real one? And it's a question that they don't answer because the fake Vision, not the fake Vision, the consciousness of Vision ends up like unlocking the memories inside of the one that is made up of just as matter. And so the white Vision ends up becoming the true Vision because he now has his consciousness and his full body, and this Vision ends up like dissolving because Wanda's power doesn't sustain him anymore. But for a period of time, there was this philosophical conundrum that said, which one is the real one? Which one is the actual Vision? Is it the one that has the memories and the experiences, but none of the physical parts that are left over? Or is it the one that has all of the physical parts that went through all of the trials and the experiences, but has none of the memories or the consciousness of what it means to be Vision? Which one is the real one? And that's a question, and it actually makes a really good case for the sort of absolutist sense of identity. It says that if you are removed from your brain, if you are removed from everything that makes up you physically, do you still retain some sense of identity? Because it's the reason why this is a conundrum is it seems that both people still have a claim to say, I am the real Vision. And so it's this question of which one is. But since this one is able to say and have a legitimate claim to I am the real Vision without having any material component to him at all, necessarily material, it seems to say that there is an absolutist sense of identity that we can hold to that says even if you are completely and totally split from your matter, you still retain some sense of identity as you. Which, if you're completely split from your matter, there has to be some immaterial part of you that makes you you. So there's some more arguments that go into that, and again, they're all roughly that deep. But I want to turn to one more question because I think this is an important question, especially for Christians. Is so if we're saying that this is our soul, or we have our soul, and we are, what do we do with our soul and the new creation, right? And there's actually different views that have been posed about the resurrection specifically. There's the traditional view on resurrection that says that after you die, you exist in a disembodied state, that you are awaiting the resurrection. There's a second view that says that people who die are immediately, their body's immediately resurrected, but they're taken away, and God creates a duplicate corpse that exists in the ground until all things are made new again, and then the corpses are done away with, and the resurrected bodies get to come back. And then there's a third view that actually says it's a recreation position on immortality, that says that once you die, like you become extinct, you don't exist anymore, and then at new creation, God recreates everything the way it's supposed to be. Those are three fun views. The traditional view seems to me to be the most plausible. Just in case you're wondering, we don't have a ton of time to talk about those, but this idea of a soul and this idea of, even coming into new creation, what does that mean for us? This gets a little bit into how you view identity. Do you think that your entire mind and consciousness is only contained within your soul? So that's Cartesianism. So your soul it's what contains your mind, it's what contains your consciousness, and it somehow interacts with your body to make it move, and your body gives it experience, and your soul feels or has different experiences based on what your body does. Personally, I'm an Aristotelian. I did a semester of study on Thomas Aquinas specifically a year ago. And this is why the second part of it is called Thomistic, because he was really, really into this idea of humans are forms that have bodies. We are souls that have bodies. And there's something so intrinsic about being human that if you take one of those pieces away, if you take away either the soul or the body, that thing ceases to be human, because it's a combination of the two things that make a human what it is. And so I think that as a Christian, you can be either a Cartesian, which says that if you are separated from your body, you are still 100% human, you're still 100% you, and you retain memories and things. And so in new creation, a Cartesian would say that your soul is somehow reunited with some kind of immortal body, and you continue living in a similar way that you do now, but you probably still retain memories and things because your soul was just disembodied, but you still have consciousness, you still have your mind in a disembodied state. On an Aristotelian view and on a Thomistic view, because your form, your soul is what gives shape to matter, as your matter has different experiences, it makes what you can think of as like imprints on your soul. Your soul is changed. Changed is not the right word for it, but it makes like imprints on your soul, where your soul has like this kind of formal memory of what your body went through. And so when you die, your soul and your body are separated. And at that point, you become something that is not fully human, because a human is defined as something that has a body and a soul, on an Aristotelian view. And so your soul, it exists, it persists in an immaterial state. And then at new creation, what Aquinas would say, Aristotle probably didn't. I don't know if Aristotle believed in the resurrection. But what Aquinas would say is that your soul is now given the chance to form new matter, new creation matter, immortal matter. And so you would retain all of your memories and all of your experiences from what happened on Earth. Your soul would still maintain the imprints of what happened, but it would now be giving form to new matter. So it's just a question of which camp do you fall in. Again, personally, I think both of them are equally valid. They both have really good arguments for both of them. I've just studied this one more, and it seems to make more sense to me of how the mind or how the body and soul interact than a Cartesian does. But that's just me.
That feels more consistent with Paul's descriptions.
Yeah.
Of the new body that we don't even really know what's going to look like.
Yeah.
We just know it's immortal.
Right. And this is where it's hard to do philosophy based only on scriptures, because Paul, writing in the first century, probably would have had access to some of Aristotle's material and might have even been shaped by some of Aristotle's thinking, being classically Greek trained. But Paul would have had zero access to this Cartesian way of thinking. However, when most people think of a soul, and most Christian people think of a soul, this is actually the first view that we usually go to, is that our soul is our mind and our consciousness and our understanding, and that it interacts with our body. So like again, this is why I'm more an Aristotelian, but it somehow interacts with the body and it's able to make it move. And as the body experiences things, the soul also has experiences that are caused by what the body is experiencing. But Paul would have had no access to that knowledge because that didn't come about until the I think Descartes was writing about the 1400s.
Well, but my question was more, not so much about resurrection and creation as it was about salvific new creation.
When we say you're a new person,
You're,
you become a new person.
Right. So
all things have passed away.
right. So this is a question of do you believe in the resurrection that humans will be reset, as it were? That for you to become a new person, you have to be completely and totally, completely and totally purged of all of your experiences to become a new person. That the old you has passed away completely, and that the new you has come. That the imperishable or the perishable has put on imperishable. It's when you start trying to get super literal with it, it seems as though you could argue one way or the other. You could say that in the new heaven and the new earth and a new creation that, everything of the past life will be completely and totally wiped away. But there also are examples in the scripture where it seems like people who have moved into paradise or into a disembodied state, they still have memory of what happened previously. And it seems like people in new creation have a general sense of, God did this awesome new thing for us. There's this new city and this new Jerusalem. And, there's still some kind of sense of understanding of what these things are based on what happened in the past. So
I
it's,
think David's still talking about.
I'm still talking about, like, if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. But I read that. To me, that's okay. Maybe it is. Well, maybe it is.
Yesterday, I was not a Christian. I wasn't going God's way. I was rebellion. I was a rebellious soul.
Well, but in
And today, I know Jesus, and so that's gone. I'm not that person anymore. I'm a new person.
yes, and that's kind of where I was going. But if that comes from 2 Corinthians, and I'm starting to look at it in the rest of the chapter, and it starts off with, we know that if this earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God. So it's really maybe more about the recreation than it is the transforming work that is happening in us.
right.
now.
And I think the other important thing to note is that Paul there is probably not talking about the life of the immortal soul, but is talking about the life that you were, like the old life that you were living has now passed away. There's a new life, there's a new way of living that has now come.
Right.
Right. And so that gets into, and again, I think this is really important, but that gets into the question of identity as a philosophical definition and identity as a personal and social definition. Because personally and socially, we could say, I was not a Christian, now I identify as not a Christian, now I identify as a Christian. But that has no bearing on my philosophical identity as the being called Michael.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, but that's a good question. Absolutely. And I think it's an important distinction that we don't do enough. Yeah.
Can I-
Please.
Okay. Would you consider, I keep going back to mental health and mental illness. Would that be part of the physical identity? That if you lose your memory because of dementia, or if you have schizophrenia and have a false sense of physical awareness, would that be considered part of your physical being and physical identity that is not related to your soul?
This is my own personal view. I'm about to make a personal statement, so everybody knows. I would say yes, it is. My understanding is that people who have those kind of mental health issues, usually it's some part of their brain that's impacted. So with Alzheimer's, it's the failing of your synapses to fire properly.
There's actually issues in your brain that medication can't help.
Right. Or that we haven't developed medication enough yet to.
Right.
Yeah, to reverse some of the processes that go on. But it's a slightly different, it's a different mechanism than what we would call the soul.
Right.
So I would say that yes, those things are physical They're physical things, they're not necessarily immaterial things. Now, an interesting question as an Aristotelian for me is, does the person experiencing Alzheimer's, does that somehow, have some kind of impact in their soul, where were they to be brought out of that and given a new body that they could now use to think, would they have memories of the experience of Alzheimer's?
Right.
And that could be, I think I'm comfortable saying, yeah, they would have memories of it.
With the body switching thing, I was also thinking, okay, if I switched into the body of somebody with Alzheimer's or somebody with schizophrenia, I would maintain my identity, but I would have different things that I'd be doing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That you're conscious, and I think maybe I'm thinking of consciousness as separate from your mentality. That consciousness is awareness, but mentality is like the way that you think, maybe, because your brain is everybody's brain is so different. Based on their
Right.
experiences, that it changes the way you think.
Yeah, and it definitely can. I'm trying to remember where I heard it specifically, but it was something that was helpful. I'm not gonna remember exactly where, but the quote is that the brain is the instrument that your soul or your mind uses to think.
It's the instrument or something.
Yeah, you can think of it like that, or an analogy that I've kind of made up, and I still don't know how much I like it or not, but your brain acts like a TV antenna to your soul. So your soul is the wavelength, and it's the frequency that your brain picks up and then uses to process things. But if your antenna is broken, or if your body doesn't work in just exactly the right way, then you're going to get a different output from your soul than somebody who has a perfectly good working antenna.
So we're back to WandaVision.
Yeah, so we're back to WandaVision again. WandaVision is a great philosophical show. I encourage you to dig into the philosophy of it. It was awesome. But yeah, and again, as this is my own personal view as somebody who holds to Aristotle's way of thinking, but it's this idea of, if this matter is shaped in this specific way, but then something happens to the matter, or something is introduced into it that causes it to to be in a certain way or in a slightly different way, then you're going to get differences in how souls express themselves.
I think for me, I think it helps thinking of, like the philosophical view of identity versus the social view of identity, because I think that's where there are things that impact us that probably has more of an effect on our social identity than necessarily our philosophical identity. So, okay, so and I'm a newbie at all this, so, but
That's okay. No, those are really good thoughts.
it's like, so if your soul is maybe, and I know this is not a perfect, this is a bad analogy, but if your soul from a philosophical standpoint is more like a form, then it's perfect. And then the things that impact me in this world, physically, emotionally, socially, that warps my social identity, or not necessarily bad, it could be good too, but it shapes my social identity, that at some point in time when I'm past this physical, we get back to the all things being made new, and the new heaven and the new earth, then I get my social identity gets reformed by my philosophical identity, or perfect identity, or consciousness, or soul.
Yeah,
Then I get brought back into a more perfect state.
right. I think those are good lines to think along, as you're thinking about that. Yeah, it's a question of how do I identify specifically as, again, the being or the human that is called whoever I am, and then the identity question that we usually ask is, okay, now how does that being specifically relate to all other beings and different social structures that have been set up around them. those are good, important questions to think. But that's my hope, was that you guys would start thinking in that way. I realize at the end of today that it probably was not as clear as I was hoping and intending that it would be. Like I said, there was a lot of material to sift through this week. So if it wasn't super clear, I do apologize. But I encourage you to, keep thinking about this. And again, I think one of the big pieces to hang on to from this, and especially in thinking about consciousness, but also in thinking about identity, is asking yourself the question, do I, as the being who identifies as whoever I am, or the being who is called whatever you are, how do I maintain that sense of identity throughout all of the different changes that I go through? Because for me, it's the simplest way to explain and to start thinking about this concept of, is there something about me that is external to the physical world? Yeah.
So this also brings to mind especially now, the conversation about identity.
Mhm.
And the thought that I may have an identity that contradicts my physical ability. Like, I dream all the time. I have countless dreams that I can fly or levitate, but I can't in this body. But I know the feeling of it.
Yeah. So, and that's a good. I'm trying to think of where I would go with that. Yeah. I encourage you to keep thinking, in those ways, and again, keep the thought that I come with a lot. This is one of the areas I haven't studied as well, and things we're looking at. But the area I keep coming back to is, what is that immaterial part of you? Because, and I said at the very beginning, I think it was right before the recording started, but if there is some kind of immaterial part of you that exists, if you have this personal identity that is able to persist, that is able to remain throughout all the different changes, the next question then becomes, where did that immaterial thing come from? Because if I have something that is immaterial about me, where like it doesn't seem like it could have come from the physical world, because it seems as though physical things can't produce non-physical things. So where did the non-physical thing come from?
It's the typical Sunday school answer.
Right. The typical Sunday school answer could work here.
Yes, no, God, or Jesus.
Right. Yeah. But it impacts that. It impacts things, thinking about resurrection, thinking about holding on to identity after death. There's so many good questions around this topic, and I hope you guys will continue to think a little bit more about it. And again, if you hear something that comes up with it, by all means, feel free to dig into it or let me know. I'm happy to help you dig into it as well. But yeah, keep thinking about those things. What we're going to look at next week, just as a quick note, I know we're a little bit over time. What we're going to look at next week it's a portion that is actually very closely related to the soul. And it's the question of free will. Do we have free will, or all of our actions determined? Basically, do we have the ability to choose what we're going to do? So we're going to look at that next week. I don't usually look at that in terms of a soul question, but if we have a soul, then that tends to lean more one way than the other way in terms of the free will discussion. So we're going to look at that next week. It'll be a lot of fun. I'm really excited. And the week after that, I believe, is time and space. Yes, it is. So next week we're going to look at free will. We're just going to tackle one of the big questions of our age, and then we'll look at the philosophy of time and space, which is not as big of a question, but I think is a lot of fun. So we'll look at those. Do you guys have any last questions, comments, concerns? Yeah.
I think it's like, it does seem like we're born with a soul, but it takes a little while to develop that awareness of me. Because, kids start going, mine, yes, no, when you're about 2. So they say that children don't realize they're different from their parents at first. That it takes a while for you to develop that you are an individual from the whole, that you have the ability to say no or the ability to say fine. You're not just like born with that immediately.
But the question I think that comes from that, and this is a good question to leave it on, is what makes you, the person now, wondering about that the same as that infant? Is there something about you that makes you the exact same, or able to identify and say, oh yeah, that's me? Like when you look at a picture of yourself as a baby and you're like, oh look, there I am. Is that actually you? Is there something about you that has persisted throughout time that long? And I would say yes, it's your soul.
You never really can see, like, a parent will say, boy, this kid is not like my first kid. This kid, each kid almost immediately has a different personality, different tendencies.
But is that genetic or a physical, like, is that a physical?
I don't think it's physical, because I mean, it's like, just like the way different babies respond, to the world. It's like we were looking at Caitlin's baby the other day, and she's just one of those babies that is so aware of everything around her. And not every baby's like that. A lot of them are just kind of, just kind of cross-eyed and just give me the bottle. I don't care. But there's just different kids will respond, and it's so baffling to mothers and parents that, well, this worked on my first kid, but this certainly isn't working on my second kid. You have every single child is born with a slightly different qualities about their personality or their soul, whatever you want to call it, that is apparent to us who have developed souls, and we can say this child's a little bit different than this child.
Well, see, I think I would be careful with equating personality with soul, and even saying that we develop soul, or that we develop some kind of soul, because that would seem to suggest that there's something called there's some immaterial part of you that's called a soul, and that soul somehow grows as your body grows. But in addition, it would also seem to say that your personality is inherent. It's something about you that is unchanging and immaterial as you go through different changes throughout your life, and I don't know that works.
I think your awareness of your soul.
Right, your awareness changes as your brain grows. Because again, the brain in your physical, like your brain is the instrument that your body uses to think, or that your soul uses to think, not your body. So if your brain grows, if you have certain aspects of your brain that are developing, and your prefrontal cortex, for example, right? They say that your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. For me, it was until 24. I don't know what it is for women, but for men, they say it's not until you're like 24 years old, which is why they have the restriction of renting a car set at the age of 24, by the way. But it's this idea of, it's because your brain is not fully able to process, different thoughts or more abstract thoughts, or, different punishment reward centers of your brain and different things like that. And so there seems to be an inherently physical piece to our thinking and to our processing. But there also seems to be some kind of separation between us and between that part of our brain that does thinking. And there's something really important about the connection between when we have a thought that we attribute to our soul and the way that our brain reacts. People, neuroscientists, a lot of times they'll point and they'll say, oh, you're having a thought, this part of your brain lit up. And as a Christian, as a dualist, I say, I would sure hope so, because if my soul is reacting and my brain isn't lighting up, then I'm probably dead. So there's an inherent connection between your brain and your soul, between the way that your brain operates and what your soul is able to do with it. I think it's hard to put personality or even those kind of things to locate them directly in the soul, because we know that those kind of things change as the brain changes. So, like, for example, one thing that people would do way back in the day is they would give people what's called a lobotomy. They would take the prefrontal cortex and they would just cut it, and that would completely and totally change the person's personality. Do a complete and total 180. But the interesting thing about that is we say, okay, this person's personality has completely changed. They act like a different person, but we still identify them as the same person. So to me, that holds more to an absolutist sense of identity, which is what we're talking about. Okay, we're way over time. I have to get to this other meeting. But thank you guys. Those are good questions, good things to think about. And like I said, I apologize if it wasn't super clear today. It was a lot I was trying to do. So yeah, next week, free will, we'll be there. It'll be good.
Got there.
Is feeling guilty